Welcome to the New York Symposium with Diane Sare. I'm Diane Sare, and today is Friday, January 19th. I think it's the birthday of Edgar Poe, very important American writer and intelligence officer. And I just have a few things to say before we get started. As you know, I'm an independent LaRouche candidate running against Kirsten Gillibrand in 2024. Now, obviously, the world is in a very great crisis, very unstable. And one of the terrible problems we face, particularly in the West, is that people have lost their ability to do critical thinking. And in fact, that ability to do critical thinking is under continuous assault from the news media and the social media, which has people divided by algorithms. So they want to try and program us into a binary way of thinking. And I'm going to get to that, but I'm going to show you something right now, actually, which is, I think, very significant in terms of what's intended and not reality, but how could you know it's not real? And that's part of what we want to take up this evening. So here we have the London Daily Mail of January 15th. Let me try and go back if I can. And basically what they're saying, if you could see that headline there, Germany is preparing for Putin attack against NATO in 2025. Leaked secret plans reveal step by step how Russia will escalate conflict to all-out war. And then don't you know it, the Russians have such a detailed plan, and apparently it's available to people at the Daily Mail. And so they've gotten a hold of their whole timeline. In February of 2024, Russia's going to get 200,000 troops together. Then by spring, they're going to launch a new offensive in Ukraine. Pretty soon, October of this year, they're sending missiles to Kaliningrad. And then there's going to be a fake border conflict in the Suwalki Gap. And then finally, a year from now, NATO will meet on the Russian threat, which you can see the hysterics at the Daily Mail will already have been well advanced. And by May of 2025, 300,000 NATO troops are going to be deployed. So just as Joe Biden said, apparently, if we don't send more weapons to Ukraine right now, American soldiers are going to be deployed in Europe. Now, of course, this is absurd. And I was pleasantly surprised that a number of congressmen said they thought it was absurd and that there is no such threat. After all, if Putin really wanted to take over all of Europe, would he not have already taken Kiev? He hasn't. Kiev is in such great shape that Nancy Pelosi, Jill Biden, everybody and their brother and their aunt is able to visit it. So that's not true. But let me get at a couple other examples of this problem in thinking before I introduce our guest, who will be dealing with something extremely important. I had a conversation with two wonderful people today who were very concerned about my participation in demonstrations against the genocide in Gaza, because according to their algorithm, if you're against genocide in Gaza, then you must have supported the terror attacks that conducted by Hamas on October 7th. Conversely, if people are concerned about the fate of the hostages, well, then they probably support the death of 25,000 Palestinians or 500,000 children who are going to die of starvation. In other words, these things aren't true, but what they do is they prevent people from actually talking to each other to figure out a way to address this, because really, hopefully there's nobody who thinks large numbers of children should be killed. I certainly don't, and I hope none of my listeners do. And if you do think they should, then I hope you won't support my campaign. But we're not allowed to have this discussion. And people are terrorized about being wrong or being on the wrong side. Another example is what we have with man-made climate change, where children are terrorized by the threat that the entire planet, as Barack Obama told us, or told the people of South Africa, if they had air conditioning and automobiles, that they were going to make the planet boil over. Well, that's obviously happening right now. And what's happened is it makes children so terrified if there is a dramatic change in weather, like it's sunny one day and then it rains the next. And probably many of you can think back to your childhood and remember that even when you were a child, sometimes it was sunny one day and rained the next day. It didn't mean the sky was falling in, but now children get into terrible panic states about any kind of weather because they've been informed that this is caused by human activity. And if you say you don't believe this, then they say, well, you obviously don't. What are you proposing? That we dump all our sewage in your drinking water? You don't care about the environment at all. And then if people do care about the environment, you could argue, well, does that mean you want to exterminate 7 billion people? Are you a genocidalist? Because that's what Al Gore is proposing. Again, people are forced into boxes and you're never allowed to have a debate. You're never allowed, they say, listen to the science. We're never allowed to examine the science. And that's why I started these symposia, so that we could discuss issues that are very important, where somebody with a lot of money may have an agenda or have a reason why they want to make us think a certain way, or that why they want to keep us divided from each other, so we never actually pinpoint who is the actual enemy of civilization. And tonight, I'm very pleased to have Professor William Happer, who is an emeritus professor of physics at Princeton University. He's an expert on some of these matters. And I also would like to say that participation in my symposium does not constitute endorsement of my campaign or any campaign. And my guests and I may often have disagreements. So the opinions expressed by us are our own. And with that, I am very glad to have you here, Professor, and please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, Diane. If it's all right, I would like to share the screen and give a little lecture. I won't give a quiz at the end, so you can relax. So here's an attempt, and this is a part of a talk that I gave a few months ago in Australia. Australia, like most of the civilized world, is plagued by climate hysterics, and so let's talk about that a little bit. So what we're facing today is yet another misguided crusade. You know, human society has been plagued by crusades as long as we have records, and most crusades end badly. You know, the reason for the crusade is very seldom really what is said about the crusade. For example, the crusades to the Middle East in the medieval times were not really about saving the true cross. It was about power, it was about money, it was about anything but true religion, but it was disguised as true religion. And today we have a crusade against carbon dioxide and supposedly a pollutant. You hear of carbon pollution, you know, I scratch my head and I wonder what they're talking about, because, you know, all of life is made of carbon. Carbon is the fundamental part of life, and yet somehow the mainstream media has managed to convince many people that they are causing carbon pollution. Well, let's talk about real pollution. This is real pollution. This is Shanghai on a bad day, and you can just barely see the Pearl Tower there in the bottle opener building. And this is the kind of pollution we really should be fighting. You know, CO2 is in the air everywhere, but you can't see it at all. It's completely transparent. So if you see something like this today, it's whatever it is, it's not CO2, or is it methane, or is it nitrous oxide? All of these things are completely transparent. So instead of addressing real problems like this one, we're all on one harebrained scheme after another to reduce our carbon footprint. Here is my wife, Barbara, not far from where I live here in New Jersey, not far from Princeton. And since I took this snapshot a few years ago, this whole area is covered now with black solar panels. They don't work at all today. They're all covered with snow. They don't work very well at night. They don't work at all, in fact, at night. So the things that we are doing are completely crazy, and yet elites all over the world are supporting this campaign, this crusade. So if you're not familiar with this book, I strongly recommend it. Get a copy. It was first published in 1842. The title is Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. And Charles Mackay, the author, described many popular delusions. And let me read you what he had to say about these things. So Mackay says, in reading the history of nations, we find that, like individuals, they have their whims and their peculiarities, their seasons of excitement and recklessness when they care not what they do. We find that whole communities suddenly fix their minds upon one object and go mad in its pursuit. That millions of people become simultaneously impressed with one delusion and run after it till their attention is caught by some new folly more captivating than the first. So our current folly, there are many of them. Diane mentioned a number of additional follies that are not connected to climate, but climate is one of the big ones, and one that is potentially very, very damaging to everybody who lives on this earth. So now I'm going to give a little bit of science background. I'm a physicist, so it's hard to resist. But when I gave this talk in Australia, I wanted to use a local example. And so the highest point of Australia is not much higher than 1.5 kilometers above Melbourne. And it's quite a bit colder there. It's 10 degrees centigrade colder at Hotel Kosciuszko than it is in Melbourne. And so that means that the cooling rate per kilometer is about 6.6 degrees. So this is just data you can read off the internet. And in fact, that figure is exactly right. The let me see if I can get a pointer on here. Let's see, laser pointer. What you notice anywhere on Earth, the temperature on the ground rapidly decreases as you go up. That's why you go to the mountains in the summer to try to keep cool. And this decrease is on the order of 6.5 degrees per kilometer of altitude. So it's quite a bit. But that continues only to 10 or 12 kilometers in temperate latitudes where we live. Then the temperature stabilizes and goes up again. And so this atmosphere is which allows us to keep warm from heating from the sun. So the sun shines on us through the clear air, or if it's cloudy, not so much, and warms the ground. If you don't have some way to get rid of the solar heat that's warming the ground, then the ground will overheat. So the temperature we live in is a balance between the sun heating the ground and the ground cooling. And the ground cools for two main reasons. One is where we live in the troposphere. When the sun is shining, the air is turning up and down, just like hot air balloons rising and, falling, rising and falling. So much of the heat where we live is carried by convection. But at this 10, 12 kilometers I mentioned, the tropopause, the convection stops. So everywhere above here, the heat is carried by radiation, which can penetrate all the way out into space and dump the excess heat from the sun. So the way the Earth warms and cools is pretty complicated, and it involves two major mechanisms, radiation and convection. These are affected by the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere and other greenhouse gases. I should say that most of the atmosphere is not a greenhouse gas. It's nitrogen and it's oxygen, which is completely transparent to the sun and transparent to the thermal energy that is radiated from the surface and the lower atmosphere. But water vapor and CO2, the major greenhouse gases, are transparent to the sun, but they're not transparent to thermal radiation. So they limit the cooling of the Earth. And without, we should say, thank God for greenhouse gases, because it's what makes the surface of the Earth warm enough to live on. Without them, it would be much too cold. We'd live on a frozen Earth, and there would be no life. So anyway, I want you to remember this picture. That another point that it makes is when people talk about the Earth's temperature, what temperature in the world are they talking about? Their temperature varies rapidly as you go up at one place, and it varies rapidly as you go north and south or east and west. So there is no single temperature of the Earth. And so crazy slogans like, keeping the temperature from rising 1.5 degrees mean absolutely nothing. It's simply slogans to deceive unwitting, well-meaning people. So now I'm going to show you what is perhaps the most important slide of today. And this is a plot of the energy that is released to space versus the frequency of the thermal radiation. So thermal radiation frequencies are measured in waves per centimeter. So this per centimeter, or 1,500 waves per centimeter. And there are two gentlemen I've attached to this slide. The top is Max Planck. Max Planck in the year finally figured out how radiation is produced. And it's to Max Planck that we owe the invention of quantum mechanics and also the first calculation of this smooth blue curve here, which is called the Planck curve today. And that's how much the Earth would radiate to space if there were no greenhouse gases. But because there are greenhouse gases, water vapor, CO2, I've indicated where they absorb thermal frequencies, the radiation to space is actually less. It's the radiation under this jagged black curve here, rather than the smooth curve that Planck calculated. Jagged black curve was introduced by another German physicist, Karl Schwarzschild, during World War I. Alas, he died on the Russian front, not from bullets, but from a rare autoimmune disease where he didn't get the proper care to maintain his life. But he showed us how to calculate this jagged black curve, which is what you actually observe if you look down from satellite. I'll show you that in a minute. But here is the important message. If you double CO2, the effect on radiation to space is that you go from the black curve to the red curve. You can hardly see the difference. So the black curve is current levels of CO2. The red curve is if you double it, 100% increase. And if you actually quantitatively look at the difference in these areas, it's only 1%, 1.1%, I think, in this case. So 1% is a good approximation. So it's a very, very tiny effect from doubling CO2. So people who knew about this long ago recognized that it's hard to make a scary case out of doubling CO2 because its effects are so small. A 1% effect for 100% change. And we're dealing today with exploitation of public ignorance to let people try to persuade the public that a 1% effect in flux is something that is an existential threat to life on Earth. So let me proceed. You might ask, I showed you a calculation. That was a calculation before, but here's a comparison of calculations like what I showed. So where it's a Sare model, that's what calculated. Like here is a calculation over the Mediterranean. Here's what a satellite observes over the Mediterranean. Here's the South Pole. And here's what's observed over the South Pole. So what you calculate, you can hardly tell from what is observed from satellites. So we really know how to calculate fluxes. Now, let me make a strong point here, and that is that everybody knows how to calculate fluxes, and you get the right answer, and it agrees with everything you observe. What you can't calculate easily is the change in temperature. So they like to fuzz over that difference, that you can do precise calculations of fluxes, but how that reflects itself in temperature is a lot harder. So let me say a few words about that. So if you calculate the temperature, you use a version of this very famous formula here. This is called the Stefan-Boltzmann formula. It says that the flux emitted by a warm body goes as the fourth power of the absolute temperature of the body times a universal constant, the Stefan-Boltzmann constant, and a emissivity, a correction term, which is a little bit less than 1. An ideal black body, this epsilon, this emissivity term would be exactly 1. For the Earth, the emissivity is about 0.7, so it's a little less than 1. And the other quantities in here, as I said, the Stefan-Boltzmann constant is well known. You can look it up. And the temperature is whatever it wants to be. It's enough to radiate the heat from the sun back to space. But the important point here is because of this fourth power of the temperature, if you do a little calculus, which I won't do in public, you find that a 1% change in flux means that you only need a 0.25% change in temperature. So the change in flux is like a change in emissivity. And so the increase in temperature from doubling CO2 will be 0.25% of the absolute temperature. And that's less than 1 degree centigrade. You can't get around this. This was known right from the beginning, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. It was well known that the direct effects of large changes of CO2 almost don't make any difference. So what's going on? What's going on is that the alarm establishment has invoked huge positive feedbacks from water vapor in order to greatly increase the direct effects of CO2. So I sometimes joke that it's affirmative action for CO2. CO2 is not a very potent greenhouse gas, and so it needs some help to even be noticeable. Well, before I completely lose the non-propeller heads who are listening to this talk, let me say a few simple things. Well, one is that, this positive feedback is very unusual. Most feedbacks in nature are negative. And that is so widespread that it even has a special name. It's called Le Chatelier's principle. So if the climate system has a positive feedback, it's very anomalous. Most other natural systems have negative feedbacks. So most likely, the warming from doubling CO2 will be less than the 0.7 degrees that we calculated, if it's like other feedbacks in nature. And here's the basic problem. The problem is that CO2 that's in the atmosphere already is like a coat of paint. And if you put a good coat of red paint on a barn, it'll look nice and red. And if you think that's not enough paint and you want to double the amount of paint, like doubling CO2, if you put a second coat of paint on the barn, it'll look just the same because the first coat of paint is just good enough. There's a maximum amount of pigment that is needed, and if you add more than that, you're simply wasting your money. And so that's the situation with CO2. The effects of CO2 are heavily saturated, just like the 2 coats of paint is no better than 1 coat of paint. Let me remind you again of what that looks like quantitatively. This is the saturation I'm talking about. So the black curve is 1 coat of CO2 paint on the surface of the earth, and the red curve is 2 coats of CO2 paint. You've doubled it, but you can see that it's only a 1% change. And unless you're very good, you can't even tell that difference. You can't easily see it by eye. You know, I have a table of numbers so I can calculate the area, but you would not be able to detect that without that. Okay, now I have one more message I'd like to put out, so we'll have time for discussion later, and that is that more CO2 not only will make almost no difference to climate, but it will be a very significant benefit to life, to agriculture and forestry. This is a field of soybeans. When I'm giving a talk, I often give a little quiz and I ask, how do you know that this is genetically modified soybeans? And every now and then there's some smart person in the audience who raises their hand and says, because there are no weeds. And that's right, this is Roundup Ready soybeans. So you can spray them with a herbicide which kills all the weeds and the soybeans are okay. So you get a much better crop without the weeds competing with the soybeans. And that's one of the things that has made food products so cheap, is that, you know, the cleverness of farmers and seed breeders and others in the agricultural industry has just enormously increased agricultural production. This is one example. So here's what happens if you add more CO2 to a growing plant. This is a laboratory experiment with a weed. This is velvet leaf. If you're a gardener, you probably have to pull that out of your garden. I do in New Jersey. This is a common weed, and it grows better with more CO2, but so does corn, so do beans, you know, so does lettuce. So any plant that is exposed to more CO2, these are the levels of CO2, glacial levels, plants almost die. This was picture was made a few years ago when CO2 levels were 350. But as you go up, there's no end in sight. More CO2 greatly increases plant productivity. Now, there are 2 main reasons for that. Let me review them. The first is that, and the most important, is that plants need less water if there's more CO2. And the reason for that is that I'll show in a later slide, but plants have to make an engineering trade-off between getting enough CO2 through holes in their leaf and leaking water back through the same holes. And so more CO2 means that plants grow leaves that have fewer holes in them and don't waste as much water. Then there's a more subtle reason, which is we'll also discuss very briefly, but plants today lose about 25% of their potential efficiency because of photorespiration, that there's so little CO2 in the air today compared to what plants are used to, that instead of using CO2, plants will, by mistake, use oxygen. And instead of making good things, they make bad things like hydrogen peroxide, ammonia, things that really are not good for the plant. And so the plant has to devote a lot of effort to countering this photorespiration problem. So here is the basic idea of a plant. The plant has to get CO2 through the air. It can't get it through the roots. It gets water through the roots, fertilizers through the roots, but all CO2 has to come through holes in the leaf. And through the same holes, oxygen that's generated by photosynthesis goes back into the air as much as possible. And water vapor leaks back into the air, and typically 100 water molecules come out of this hole for every CO2 that comes in. So this is a very leaky and wasteful system for water. So if plants are stressed for water, and over most of the world they are, if you're not in a greenhouse or in, a tropical rainforest, water is a big problem. So the low CO2 levels, I will mention just in passing, have fostered the development of another photosynthetic pathway. Most plants follow this C3 pathway. It's called in honor of Calvin, the scientist at Berkeley who worked out all of the photosynthetic pathways back in the 40s and 50s. But C4 plants are able to cope with lower amounts of CO2 like we have today, and examples of those are corn and sugarcane is another example. So they're important, but they're a minority, and both types of plants, C3 and C4, they all do much better if there's more CO2 in the air. I mentioned photorespiration, and this is maybe a little too detailed, but the most abundant protein in the world is this protein called rubisco. By weight, this is by far the largest, and that's natural because it's the thing that allows green plants to fix carbon dioxide and convert it into sugar, combine carbon dioxide and water and use energy from the sun to make sugar. And the machinery that does that is this enzyme rubisco, the weight of protein in the world. But it was designed when there was no oxygen in the air. And so by bad luck, it's poisoned by oxygen. And so times like today, when there's very little CO2 compared to geological norms and plenty of oxygen, about 25% of the time, this little machine, instead of doing what it's supposed to in making sugar, makes things like hydrogen peroxide and oxygen just by mistake. And so plants know about this problem, and they spend a lot of biological energy coping with this. If you double the CO2 concentration, then you half the number of these harmful oxygenation effects. And so the plant grows better. So that's another advantage of CO2. One is it lets plants use less water. Secondly, it suppresses photorespiration. You can see this over the whole world. This is satellite pictures of chlorophyll. And you can see that the entire world since 1982 to 2010, when this picture was made, and it's even better today, is getting greener and greener. And most of this is from CO2 fertilization. And you can see the fertilization is most important in drier parts of the globe, the dry Western United States and Canada, the Sahel, the dry Western parts of Australia, the Deccan Plateau in India. So thank God for more CO2. It's been a major factor in the increase in agricultural productivity. So I'm just about finished, and so I'll hope that in our discussion we can talk about some of the causes of how is it possible that CO2, which is a major benefit to life, it really is the gas of life, has been demonized. And some of the causes, I won't go through them, we may talk about them informally, are noble lies, they're political lies, they're ignorance. Many people just don't know. Many people are stupid. And of course, as always, there are lots of greedy people who benefit from all of the demonization. And why should we care? Those of you listening to this, you should care about this, because it's not like astrology. You shouldn't care if people waste their money on horoscopes. It's not going to harm you. It's not going to harm the economy. But if people are carried away with climate hysteria, it will cause enormous harm eventually. So I'll close with a quote from Dietrich Bonhoeffer about what happens. And so Dietrich Bonhoeffer says, if I see a madman driving a car into a group of innocent bystanders, then I can't simply wait for the catastrophe and then comfort the wounded and bury the dead. I must try to wrestle the steering wheel out of the hands of the driver. Many of you know Dietrich was one of the very few brave clergymen who opposed Hitler and the Nazis. And he was doubly brave because he refused to leave his native land of Germany. And he refused to shut up, and so he continued to criticize the atrocities of the Nazi Party. And alas, he was hung before it was possible for the Allies to rescue him. But he did a lot of good in the meantime, and I wish he were around today to help us with some of the other crazy things that we're dealing with. So I'll stop now, Diane, and maybe we can have a little discussion.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. Could you stop screen sharing so we can see each other? Great, and maybe Jason can join us as well. I thought I would actually let Jason begin with some thoughts and comments and responses, and then go back to you, Jason.
Well, I really want to thank Professor Happer for that fantastic presentation of, detailed, funny, very, very useful. I think there's a lot of things to take from that. To me, I just think about how all-encompassing this CO2 or more broadly this climate issue has become in discussions all around the world. I was just a couple of days ago speaking with a young woman in Afghanistan who's working on education programs there to get around some of the difficulties with educating women and also just education in general in that country to aid in its development. And among the courses proposed, where she's looking for outside mentors to help her program, she had mentioned environmental issues, which, and it's just sort of, it's in the air. We talked about it. And I said, I don't really think that should be a priority, that CO2 obviously shouldn't be a priority for a country like Afghanistan at present. Focus on development first. And that's true even for some other pollutants, not just the non-pollutant of CO2. And it's not that she understood that, but it's in the air and it's everywhere. And it's this really frightening, suicidal type of urge that seems to have gripped so many people in cultural ways that go beyond, CO2 and the supposed science behind it. But I think that it finds its expression more broadly in a sort of, just rush towards, a rush towards oblivion. In other aspects of culture. So, I think that the case that Dr. Happer put forward is, it's very clear. And I think that this is a message that should be gotten across broadly. I've noticed that there's a lot of people who recognize that there's something rotten in the state of climate science. And they'll try to avoid the tough issues by simply saying that it's better to invest in improving our climate mastery than to invest in trying to prevent climate change by stopping CO2. But the level that's needed, I think, is really what we were able to experience here tonight, to go directly at the scientific issue and see that truly the emperor has no clothes here.
Yeah, Jason, I thank you for that. And I think a big part of the problem, especially with young people, is that they need a cause that's bigger themselves. Some of them used to get it from religion, many don't anymore. And what am I here for? Why am I living? Why am yeah, I'd like to do something that's significant. And so, of course, they're grasping for things, and they've been given this phony cause, of saving the planet from CO2. And it's really disgraceful, because you have all this enthusiasm. They want to do something good. And instead of doing something good, they're doing something just completely crazed. And this happened during the real Crusades. You know, there were these disreputable people who wandered around Northern Europe, Germany, and France in particular, and they recruited a children's crusade, you know, to save the true cross. And so the poor children went marching off to Palestine. Almost none of them survived. Most of them were killed. And but the entrepreneurs who organized this made a lot of money, right? So not everybody was disappointed in the results. And that's happening today too. You know, I'm sure you know many people are profiting just obscenely from the climate hysteria.
Sure. And you know, in terms of achieving political ends, I mean, if you have a goal of preventing development or undoing development, if you'd much rather have a country that has a lot of raw materials remain in a poorer state so that it's less able to assert its sovereignty over those resources, or move up the value chain and do more transforming those into higher level products, and you'd rather just get the raw materials, preventing development is a fantastic way of achieving that. And just to reflect on what you just said about how people do want a mission, because that's true, and you know, and how that's perverted with this phony thing, you know, it makes me think about the extent to which a positive vision of the future has to be part of the antidote to taking on the CO2 myth. I mean, there's truly wonderful things that young people could be devoting themselves to. We've got a whole universe out there to explore. We've got secrets of the atom that, you know, we haven't figured out yet. We've got poverty in the world to eliminate through development. I mean, there's a lot of actually useful missions that young people could profitably and happily and meaningfully take on with their lives.
I'd like to bring up a comment and ask you, Professor, how you would respond. Someone writes, "It's undeniable that human activity causes climate change. The question is how much." What would you say to that?
Well, I guess I would agree with that. I mean, I think that CO2 will cause a little bit of warming. I just told you my estimate is if you double it, it'll be about 0.7 degrees centigrade. You know, if the climate is like other systems, there will be negative feedback. So maybe it's 0.4 degrees or 0.5 degrees. You know, that would be the normal guess. But
now, why shouldn't we panic about that?
Why should you panic about a half a degree? Well, you know, if you look around, you know, people my age, none of us ever moved to Canada. We moved to Mexico or Florida or Texas. You know, warmer is better.
Now, I actually had a question because you were saying that having less CO2 creates a stress on plants and causes them to need more water.
Right.
Where are we getting less CO2? Is that a problem? And why is that happening?
Well, if you look at the geological record of CO2, which you can infer from various proxies, for the last million years or so, you can look at bubbles in the Antarctic ice and, you know, measure the fraction of CO2 in the bubbles, and that fluctuates up and down with the glacial cycles. And if you go much further into the past, tens of millions of years, there are other ways to estimate how much CO2 is there. And so over most of geological history, CO2 concentrations have been 4, 5, 6 times greater than they are now, measured in several thousand parts per million, not 400. We're just over 400 now. And that's way, way less than most plants prefer. Greenhouse operators, for example.
Wait, so I just want you to say that. So you're saying that there used to be a lot more CO2 in the air?
Oh, yeah, of course. That's common knowledge to geologists, at least. Maybe not to Al Gore.
So you mean no matter what a windbag a local politician is, they're not going to replenish the CO2?
Well, you know, if you talk about the social cost of carbon, which lots of people do, if you're honest about it, the social cost is negative because more CO2 is increasing agricultural productivity. It's having essentially no effect on climate. And so the net result is a benefit to humanity. If we were to could get all the CO2 out of the air and go back to 280 parts per million, pre-industrial levels, we would lose 30-40% of agricultural productivity. So a good fraction of the world would starve to death. So just feeding the current world population is completely dependent on the increases of CO2 we've had. There are other factors too. Use of fertilizer has been very important, better seed varieties, but CO2 has been at least as important as all the rest of those.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's interesting that what Dan had brought up about thinking through how the shortage of CO2 means that plants have to lose more water to get in the amount that they need, and how I'm just thinking about the deserts, the map that you had shown about the increase in agricultural output due to CO2. And we've got, large parts of the earth where there's hardly any plant life at all. And desalination and these kinds of things are, in my mind, a big part of being able to improve that. But it's really interesting to think about how transforming the CO2 level in the atmosphere will allow plants to colonize areas that would have been too arid for them at lower levels. I mean, that's
being observed, Jason. There's not much doubt that that's happening.
Mm-hmm.
And you can look at photographs, for example, of the American West that were taken 150 years ago, and daguerreotypes and were just being developed. And you photograph the same area today, it's much greener today than it was on the original photographs. Or you can look at, say, botanical specimens in, museums that were collected in the year 1850, and an elm leaf, for example, like the one I showed, and you can count the little holes in the leaf. And then you compare it to a leaf today, and you notice that the elm leaf in 1850 had, 30 or 40% more holes than it does today. It doesn't need as many holes today because there's more CO2. So it's losing less water today than it did in 1850. And so this is all very, very solid stuff. There's just no question that it's happening.
On the sort of almost religious opposition to thinking about good news about this, in San Francisco, at one of the museums there, they had an exhibit about the impact of CO2 on plant growth. And the portion of the exhibit was called Our Itchy Future, because they specifically said, poison ivy grows much better when there's more CO2. It's
true. It does. But so does wheat, and so does corn, and so does lettuce. Yeah. Not everybody, dislikes poison ivy. My wife's parents have a little farm, and their horses just love poison ivy.
Really?
That's the first thing they eat. So I wouldn't dare, but they seem to love it. Yeah.
Well, maybe we should talk a little bit about what does affect the climate more than CO2.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good point, Diane. I think this sort of manic fixation on CO2 has set back real climate science by 50 years, maybe more. Because until, 1980s or 90s, there was a small community of very good people who were studying climate. They were honest, they were imaginative, they were self-critical, they didn't have very much money, and they got many answers right with not very much support. And then money started pouring in from Washington to reinforce the idea that there was an emergency. And so it was a sort of a Gresham's law, all of a sudden there was this money to be had. It didn't matter whether you were smart or dumb, you could get the money as long as you promised to come up with some alarming so-called scientific results. And so we've got a whole community now that has been degraded, I would say. It's not just climate. I mean, it's happened in other areas too. Yeah, I'm sure you're familiar with the problems in biomedical research, where most papers, you can't reproduce them. They're not true. And but it's been very bad for climate, and it's been very bad for the science of the field. My personal view is that it almost certainly has something to do with the sun, but the sun is very subtle, and it may not be directly the heat from the sun. It could well be something to do with the solar magnetic fields affecting cosmic rays. And we could have worked a lot of this stuff out faster if we hadn't wasted so much resources on this clearly inadequate, dogma that there's only one controlled knob for climate, and that's CO2. I mean, it's just so absurd, because nothing else in the world has one controlled knob. It's this would be the first time ever if that were the case. Everything has many influences acting at the same time, and it's very hard to disentangle one from the other. And that's true of climate too. As I say, I'm sure greenhouse gases cause a little bit of warming, but they're not the major warming effects, because we've seen warmings just as fast as this, even greater back, say, in the year 1000, when, it got so warm in Greenland that you could farm it. The Norse settled there, they bought farms, they produced barley and hay and sheep and shipped them back to Iceland and Norway. And 200 years later, climate took a turn for the worse. Worse being it got colder, right? In general, cold is bad and warming is good. But they got frozen out eventually. You can't farm Greenland now. It's still too cold, Areas which, for example, were whales at the time of the Norse, are full of ice now. So there's no groundwater to come up from the well. So these things happen naturally, and they're big, but much bigger than the warming we've seen today. And instead of honestly trying to find out why and learning better how to cope with it, we've wasted all of this time on hysteria over CO2.
If I may, I'd actually like to get your take, delving a little more into the role of the sun. I've been really interested in the cosmoclimatology, the work of Nir Shaviv and others on how the sun's changing intensity could modulate the impact of cosmic rays acting to cause the formation of clouds. Is that something that you've looked into much? Do you have any thoughts on that hypothesis?
I tremendous respect for Nir Shaviv and his colleague Hendrik Svensmark from Denmark. Against all odds, they have made great progress here, and the evidence that they show is very persuasive. You can see very tight correlations between solar activity and the climate. It's much, much better than any correlation with CO2, where there's practically no correlation. So maybe that's a straw man to fight against, but it's actually pretty good. I think they're onto something. There are others too who have alternate theories of how the sun might affect the climate. But look out any day. It's the sun that keeps us warm. We get a tiny amount of heat from geothermal heat, from under our feet, but that's 1,000 times less than we get from the sun. So it's just not enough to be very important, except in very special cases. Yeah.
Someone's asking, what would be the effect on global CO2 levels of large-scale irrigation of arid and large desert areas? So what if we started just getting a bunch of water into dry areas? Would that affect the CO2 level? That's what the person's asking.
Well, it's pretty hard to localize CO2 in any economical way because, the Earth's atmosphere is a big place. So whatever CO2 we release or China releases, it mixes with the air all over the world right away. I think any increases in CO2, though, will help with arid regions of their world. Agriculture there will improve. Yields will improve. And it's actually, surprisingly, it's not just it's not just dry land. You know, one of the reasons that you have these fantastic fisheries off of Peru, you know, and the Ecuador, is because of the upwelling of nutrients, including CO2. So the water that is sucked up from the Humboldt current there is loaded with CO2, and that's one of the reasons the plants are doing better there. So it's another fertilization effect. Nitrate is important, phosphate's important, but CO2 is not trivial. So, most plants, if you go into a cornfield today, by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, if there's no wind, the CO2 has been sucked out of the air. So there's not enough CO2 for the corn to continue to grow. So it's a very dramatic effect. It's also true in the water, so by mid-afternoon in, productive seawater or ponds, most of the CO2 has been used up. And that's quite dangerous actually for fish farmers, because the CO2 in a fish farm neutralizes some of the alkalinity that the fish produce. The fish pee ammonia. So, a fish pond, after a while, gets quite basic. It's a little bit like Drano. And so if you didn't have the CO2, to neutralize the alkalinity, it would eventually kill the fish. And that happens, so if you use up all the CO2, which does occur because of the rapid growth of plants. They just use it up, and then the alkalinity goes way up, 9 or 10, and your whole crop of catfish die.
So could greening,
everything
irrigating
about CO2 is good. We have 40,000 parts per million of CO2 in our blood, and if you have less than that, it's a real problem. There are clinical syndromes.
So I have a question. If we grew a gigantic new rainforest, would we be using up too much CO2?
Well,
now
forests clearly suck up a lot of CO2, because every spring, if you look at CO2, especially in the northern hemisphere where there's a lot of land, CO2 levels plummet, and they drop by 10, 15, 20 parts per million from early spring to late fall. And that's because of the growth of plants in the north. And, if the winter didn't come to let them begin to decompose, what you say could happen. We could use up all of the CO2, and, plant life would come to an end. My friend and colleague Patrick Moore, who was one of the founders of Greenpeace in Canada, Greenpeace Canada, keeps making that point that maybe humans have come along just in time to save life on Earth by finally burning some of the fossil fuels, which have sequestered CO2 for so long that it's beginning to be dangerous for plant life. So it's a little bit like the Gaia hypothesis. I'm not that deep, but I know it's a good thing for life. Yeah.
Well, we need to wrap up soon. And this is not a really simple question, but I thought you might have some ideas on what could be done to improve the conception of scientific method. That is, we have, I think, a terrible problem of younger people and older people who no longer have an internal metric of how to determine whether something might be true or not. And myself, as a musician, think that studying classical music, for example, you can't escape a certain harmonic ordering or knowing that there are certain principles. I think that would be very important, but obviously there are questions of scientific method which we've really lost. How do you think we should address that? What should children be involved in for them to develop this?
Well, you're touching on a very important point, is what's happening to our children and how are they being educated. And it's a special problem today because of all of the mass communication. If you look at any kid, they've all got a cell phone, and instead of looking at a book, they're looking at a cell phone. And what they're looking at in the cell phone wasn't critical thinking, it's what their other friends are thinking about them. So that we've got this generation of young people that all they worry about is what is everybody thinking about me, and what are they writing on the cell phone to each other and to my little peer group. So I think it's a serious problem, and unless you're an unusual young person, your education is greatly degraded by spending so much time worrying about what your peers are thinking about you. So I don't know, this is not my specialty. I'm really good at solving differential equations, but I've never been much good with people. And but I can recognize there's a problem, and I'm not. I think we all have to think about ways to solve that. Certainly, I mean, giving more respect to schools would help. If you look at, I've seen lots of students, that have come through Princeton, gone to high school, they've come to college, and I've taught them. And it's quite striking that children from groups that value education, Chinese, Koreans, first generation immigrants from Europe, they do very well. And it's partly because they get so much encouragement at home. They come home and the mama asks, well, what did you learn today? Was it something interesting? Tell me about it. Whereas if, the Americanized kid goes home, the parents really don't have any time for them or they don't ask the right questions. And so I think if we could somehow encourage parental support and community support more than we do, I don't know how you do that. I noticed that, for example, when I was younger, I was at Columbia University in New York City, and we had my wife and I went to a little Presbyterian church there, and it had a large number of Jamaicans, Black, essentially the same genes as our neighbors in Harlem, but they were indistinguishable in their attitude toward their children from anyone else. They were worried about them getting good grades, getting into a good university, getting their homework done, not getting into a bad crowd. And so they came with this tradition. Colin Powell came from that tradition. So it really makes a difference. If you have a community that supports you, you will turn out to be a good kid. You'll be a success. And if you don't, you'll go off the rails.
Jason, did you have any thoughts on that?
Just that this point of the importance of cultural appreciation for education. I mean, I think there's things to say about pedagogical technique that we're not going to get into in this conversation, but that to me, that cultural issue is so clear that I think it's really regrettable the gymnastics that people go through to avoid noting that and looking for other explanations when really a very simple one, a very direct one, and one that's susceptible of being acted on is sort of staring you in the face. That's my reflection on that. More broadly, I feel like after hearing this this presentation on CO2, that CO2 deserves to have a statue in every city to the CO2 molecule. I'm reminded of Ben Franklin's short comedic story, The Speech of Polly Baker, which is modeled on Socrates as portrayed in Plato's Apology, where he's sentenced to death, and they say, well, you could also propose an alternative punishment. How do you think you should be punished? And he says, well, to be honest, you should give me a pension. He completely flips it around. And I feel like CO2, in its if it's able to get its day in court, would say, hey, you've got it all backwards. I deserve your praise.
Mm-hmm. Now, I do have to just ask one more question, which is kind of interesting. Does the reduction in water vapor, this is from someone watching, released from plants offset the global warming potential of the increase in CO2. So I think he seems to be asking, is there not some kind of equilibrium where if you have more CO2, the plants release less water, which is another warming gas. So maybe maybe you wouldn't get any warming change.
Well, that's a good point. Transpiration from plants will decrease a little bit if you add more CO2 because of the fewer holes in the leaf that we mentioned. And I don't think that will make that much of a difference because a good fraction of the water in the atmosphere comes from the oceans. It's 70% of the Earth's surface. And so more CO2 is not going to make much difference there. And, land too, much of the CO2, much of the water vapor comes from moist soil. And so that won't be affected very much by less transpiration through the leaves, but it will be an effect. Almost everything's an effect at some level. And so the question is, how big is it? And should you worry about it, or will it be good even?
Right. Well, that's the really optimistic thing, is there's so much we don't know. At least I find that optimistic.
Yeah.
It would be really boring if we knew everything. I mean, then why would we be here? So I think that's...
Well, Diane, I have to apologize. My internet connection is not the greatest, and had it not been for the snowstorm, I would have taken this from my office. But where's global warming when you need it?
Right. Well, I want to really thank you for joining me this evening. I think the presentation was very helpful. I hope the people watching circulate it. The graphics were clear and the discussion excellent. So thank you both, Jason and Dr. Happer. And I hope we do this again. And I hope that the world shapes up so we can have more conversations about these matters and not about who's dying where and what weapons we shouldn't be sending someone. So thank you both. And
absolutely, I agree with you there.
Thank you. Just a couple announcements tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. for younger people. There is a conference call with Helga Zepp-LaRouche of the Schiller Institute. I guess you can send a direct message to me on Facebook or go to the Schiller Institute website and ask about it. On February 18th, there will be a national Sare for Senate day-long conference. That's the Sunday of President's Day weekend. And as I've said, my campaign is being run as a nationwide campaign because our choices for the presidency are not really up to par. And we have to create a national movement that raises the standard and involves the American people in insisting that our so-called representatives actually uphold principles that are worthy of the Constitution and the American people. So Sunday, February 18th in New York City, I'd love for you to come in person. I think there's something about this on my website. If not, there will be soon, or you can send an inquiry at info@sareforsenate.com. And as always, if you're a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident and you haven't yet given your $3,300 to the campaign, I know exactly how to spend it. So please send your donations. And thank you very much for being with us. And I hope to see you next week.